Welcome, friends. This morning's interactive event is COP26, Enough, Peace, Militarism and the Climate Crisis and Missing Peace. So this morning's event is hosted by three Quaker organisations: Northern Friends Peaceboard, Quaker Council for European Affairs and Quaker Peace and Social Witness, which is part of British Friends Quakers in Britain. We are recording the event this morning. If you prefer not to be seen, please turn your camera off now. And now we'll start with, in the manner of Friends, a short period of silence. Thank you, friends. So just a few words of housekeeping. Our event today will last for about an hour and a half. We aim to finish at 11:30 London time, and we will not hold any breaks, so we should run smoothly through all the various presentations, which I'll tell you about in a moment. In the usual way, when it comes to opportunities for questions, you can either put your question in the chat or you can raise your hand using the reactions or by waving. If we reach the large number that we have signed up for the event, it'll become harder for those of us who are moderating to see everyone on screen. So it might be that if you don't feel you're being noticed, we ask you to speak and ask your question. But we can come to that when we come to the questions and answers. So some introductions. I'm Martin Ford. I'm one of the trustees of British Friends of Quaker Council for European Affairs. And I'm going to ask everyone involved in today's session and the panel members to introduce themselves now. So first of all, in the order that they appear, first of all, Philip, and then Saskia, and then Stuart, and then Sheila.
Hello everyone, I'm Philip Austin. I'm the coordinator for Northern Friends Peaceboard, which works with and for Quakers in the north of Britain.
Good morning everyone, my name is Saskia Bassa. I'm the Peace Program Assistant at QCA, the Quaker Council for European Affairs, and I'm joining you today from Brussels.
Hi, I'm Stuart Parkinson, Director of Scientists for Global Responsibility, which, if you don't know us, we're a UK organisation that promotes science and technology that contributes to peace, social justice and environmental sustainability.
Hafaday, Tiro. My name is Sheila Babauta. I am from the Northern Mariana Islands. I'm a young legislator in our local House of Representatives. I am the chairwoman of the Natural Resources Committee, and I also hold key leadership roles in two nonprofit organizations, the Friends of the Marianas Trench and Our Commonwealth 670. Happy to be here.
Thank you very much for all those introductions. We're in for a really interesting and we hope thought-provoking session today, leading on to consideration of what actions we can each take. So the structure will be some introductions in relation to the role of Quakers and Peace from Philip, and then a presentation and some short questions for clarification from Stuart's presentation, and then similarly a presentation from Sheila with some short questions for clarification. And then we hope to have a solid half an hour or so at the end of the session for questions and answers for everyone on the panel, where we try and focus on what actions we might take in our various locations in response. So, Philip.
Thank you, Martin. I'm just going to share some reflections really on why we're here reflecting on these connected issues and concerns. I think many and if not most of us here are already involved in or aware of the long-standing Quaker commitment to peace known as our peace testimony. And this comes from our understanding and our life as a faith community, and was expressed early on by the early Quaker George Fox, who wrote in 1650 that Friends Quakers were called to live in the virtue of that life and power that takes away the occasion of all wars. In other words, living in a way led by the spirit, in Quaker terms, that removes the causes of war. And over the centuries since, how we live with one another on this planet, whether at local, personal or international level, has been of concern to Quakers. Peace is one expression of this, as are social justice and increasingly planet care and climate justice. We know these issues are connected, brought together by a need to move from a world shaped by behaviour to dominate and control other living beings. War and militarism can grow from and also feed such injustice. So our vision as Quakers is of transformed relationships through peaceful means, acknowledging and engaging with the systems, structures and communities that can and do make a difference. The Quaker Peace Testimony will often mean that we are at odds with government, and we will find different routes for taking action, from supporting careful, quiet diplomacy to engaging in a variety of non-violent action and working to build and develop alternatives. We are at this time again facing a situation of great urgency in which we must work together. And it gives me great encouragement to feel that we're part of a global network just through this call today. Working together to share and build our vision of peace with justice, with one another and with the planet. So I'll hand over now to Saskia, who's going to introduce our speakers and facilitate that part of the session.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Martin. Thank you both for wonderful introductions to the session today. I am honored to present today to the speakers of this event. They will be presenting some of their work around climate, peace, and militarism in relation to COP26 for about 20 minutes each. After the presentations, we will allow for 5 minutes, more or less, of Q&A from the audience. Keep in mind that this was a short Q&A only for clarifications, directly to the speakers, because we'll have a more solid space for conversation at the very end. So without further ado, we welcome our first speaker today. Dr. Stuart Parkinson is Executive Director of Scientists for Global Responsibility. The organization is a UK-based organization of several hundred scientists and engineers promoting peace, social justice, and environmental sustainability. He holds a PhD in climate science and has been an expert reviewer for the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is better known as the IPCC. He has 30 years experience in researching and campaigning on climate issues and is a lead actor of 2 in-depth reports on UK and EU military carbon emissions. Stuart, thank you so much for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and thank you so much for organizing this event. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to share a few slides. Hopefully you can see these as they start to appear.
Yes, you can see well.
Right, just rearrange my screen. Okay, so I'm going to talk about COP26 peace and the carbon footprint of the military. And I'm going to start off by talking about the military carbon footprint. And I'm going to use some of the reports that we have highlighted, we have written, published in this area over the past 2-3 years, and also some other research by other campaign groups, academics, and some research and data from the military itself. So the first thing to say, to try and define, is what is a military carbon footprint? Well, some of you will be familiar with the term the carbon footprint, which is the amount of carbon emissions that a product or an activity causes, both while it's happening and through the life cycle of its creation. And on the left side of this diagram, that's roughly the carbon footprint of the military. So you've got the fuel use, burning fuels in fighter planes, warships, electricity and other energy use at military bases. You've got the supply chains from the arms industry and its supply chain and the raw materials that supply that industry, and other suppliers for things like uniforms, food, IT, and then the land that the military owns as well. So all the emissions, the carbon emissions that arise from those activities are on the left, and that would make up a conventional carbon footprint. But why we call it a bootprint is because the use of military equipment causes so many other emissions, carbon emissions, through warfighting in some shape or form. So you've got direct impacts like blowing up an oil depot or destroying a forest. You've got things like healthcare of the survivors or post-conflict reconstruction. So together they make quite a substantial amount of things. In the UK, and I'm going to use the UK as an example because this is where we've done a lot of our research, we estimate that the military carbon footprint, I note this is not the bootprint, we weren't able to gather enough data to estimate the whole bootprint. So this is just the footprint part of it. We estimated at about 11 million tonnes. And this is about equivalent to running 6 million cars for a year. So it's quite a sizable amount. And one of the things that's particularly disturbing about these figures is that when you look at the official figures, they don't really reflect this large impact. So for example, in the Ministry of Defence annual reports, they only quote the headline figure for emissions due to military bases. So that's the little dark blue slither at the bottom of the graph on the right where the arrow is pointing. That's what you see as a headline figure when you look in these reports. And if you dig down into the appendices, into the data sections, you can find a bit more data. But none of it gives you an estimate of the whole carbon footprint. And so that's why we ended up trying to do this work to at least give a much more representative idea of what these emissions were. If we look at the EU, and we also did a study looking at the EU emissions, and we looked at 6 countries in the EU, and one country in particular, Poland, we couldn't find any data for. So we didn't actually come up with an estimate at all. But other countries, other major military spenders in the EU, we were able to find some official data that was reported to the official UN Climate Convention Secretariat. And we found that Germany, Italy, Netherlands and Spain were submitting some data. France weren't submitting any data on military emissions. And then we put together from other sources, other in-country sources, we were able to put together an estimate of what we thought their carbon footprint was. And you can see how much bigger it is, again, than official figures. But of course, Europe's not the biggest spender. And we have some figures here from the US. And this is our estimate of the total military carbon footprint. So that's the blue bar on the right compared with the UK in grey and the EU in orange. You can see that it's about 6 times larger than the total European total. And then for countries beyond, Russia, China, other large military spenders, we just don't have data at the moment to be able to estimate those. And we're trying to fill some of those gaps in a new research project. What can we say about the global military carbon bootprint? Well, the best we can say that is that it's about several % of all carbon emissions. And a lot of it is excluded, a lot of it is simply not counted. And so it's not included within the carbon targets that are widely talked about and widely reported on within UN circles. So this is a serious loophole and for the convenience of the militaries and a severe problem for the rest of us. But this global military carbon blueprint is equivalent to something like a large European nation, say like Italy or France. So it's a serious amount of emissions. And even these estimates are conservative because of the exemptions that the military have had over the years, and I can talk about that more in the discussion if you're interested. And the other aspect of the carbon blueprint of the military, which almost always gets forgotten, is the role of nuclear weapons. And there are two elements to this. One is the way in which a climate change, through destabilizing the world through its various impacts, could lead to the rise of a war and possibly a nuclear war. But it's also the way in which a nuclear war could have catastrophic climate impacts itself. So the first one, the biggest risk here is the possibility of nuclear war by accident. And if you look at data gathered over the Cold War, there are estimates that there was a near miss one time every 3 years, which is a scarily frequently amount. So we were very lucky during the Cold War. But then there are things happening now that make us realize that we need to be lucky for a lot longer. We've got cyber warfare happening now, which can interfere with the computers, military computers. And of course, we've got the current crisis over Ukraine, leading to another standoff between Russia and NATO. And climate change itself can cause political instability through its impact on food supplies, water, causing migration. And Pakistan and India, the nuclear weapon states, are particularly vulnerable here. So there's a lot of things to be concerned about the possibilities of a nuclear war by accident or miscalculation. And then if you look at if nuclear weapons are actually used, well, the explosions would be so intense, and if we had a sufficient number, a few dozen large ones or a few hundred smaller ones, the amount of smoke that would be produced would be injected into the upper atmosphere, move around the world, and you'd get a rapid cooling, which would have catastrophic effects on food supplies. And that's shown in this graph here. So we've got a temperature graph. The blue line is the temperature increase over the last 100 years. And then the scenarios are of nuclear war are shown in the red, green, and brown dips after this. So that's the effects of a small, medium, and large nuclear war. And you can see if you have a nuclear war, you get a rapid cooling over the first couple of years, and then a bounce back to the warming trend, a rapid cooling followed by a bounce back to the warming trend, depending on how many nuclear weapons you use. And even a small one, it would have a catastrophic impact on human society and on natural ecosystems. And just to emphasize that, you've got here's a scenario. This is the most extreme scenario if the US and Russia launched its nuclear weapons at each other. So this is a map of the world and the temperature, a computer model of the temperatures, the temperature reduction in summer. So we're looking at 20 to 35 degree temperature drops in the main temperate areas, and that gives you an idea of just how catastrophic this change would be. So what about trying to reduce all these impacts? The military has recognized that there are problems in relation to its work over climate, and we've seen in the run-up to COP26, we had a series of reports published, particularly by the UK, the US, and NATO around military climate issues. Some of them were a bit more in-depth or expansive than others. None of them really represented a rigorous strategy for reducing emissions, but at least they're on the table now. But one of the concerns here is particularly around the approach that's being taken. So very much the aim, we have the aim I've quoted here, to seek to use the green transition to add to capabilities. So what that means is basically using green technologies to give you an edge on the battlefield. And that's a bit disturbing. And then you have, to fight and win in ever more hostile and unforgiving physical environments as climate change takes hold, we must find a way of continuing to win wars. It's not terribly encouraging in terms of trying to find a more peaceful world. And when you look at the proposals that they have for reducing their own carbon emissions, there are all sorts of problems here. So you've got a reliance on biofuels, for example, even though that a lot of these are from energy crops and that would compete with food crops for land. Or you've got synthetic fuels, which are very speculative at the moment and very high energy intensive to produce. You've got more drones and robots and cyber warfare, which is hardly encouraging, or the use of more nuclear power in warships or at bases. And if they don't manage to reduce their emissions, then they're looking to use offsets, including growing more trees on military land, which, yes, we would like to encourage that, but if that's a key part of their plan, it's not terribly ambitious. And the Americans really put it in a way that I think is quite striking in this report, down in the right corner. They called it more fight, less fuel. So that's the overall strategy. And what we really need is much more consideration of alternative approaches to improving security. And of course, acknowledging that there is a climate threat from nuclear weapons, and this is yet another reason to rapidly phase out nuclear weapons. So alternatives. I want to give here another example from the UK. This is comparing military and climate spending in the UK. So the British government post-Brexit held a budget on post-pandemic largely. And these are its projected spending figures. So what I've done here is compare the core military budget spending, overseas aid spending, and spending on reducing carbon emissions by central government over 4 years. And you can see that the military spending is considerably larger than the reducing carbon emission spending and of overseas aid as well. And indeed, what we've seen over the last 18 months is that the government has taken the opportunity during the pandemic to massively increase military spending, the largest increase in military spending for 70 years since the Korean War. And they've done this by cutting aid spending. They of course don't link the two in any of their documents, but if you look at the fall in aid spending due to the cut that they say is necessary because the public purse is under so much pressure due to the pandemic, and yet the military spending is increased by virtually the same amount. So it's really quite striking and shows you that they are shifting, instead of shifting towards more peaceful ways of dealing with insecurity problems, they are moving much more to more aggressive problems. And this is a part of a wider trend with military spending targets, a 2% of GDP spending targets that are pushing up military spending across NATO. And this can often fuel carbon emission rises as well. And against a background of global military spending that's nearly hit $2 trillion per year. And I put all the zeros there just to make sure once people start talking millions, billions and trillions, it's very easy to get lost at just how big the numbers are you're talking about. So it's the one with 12 zeros. So what is really going on? And this is what I think is key here, is there is an unspoken strategy that militaries are actually helping to preserve the global inequalities, the inequalities inherent in the economic system and the political systems. And you can see this, a very useful Greenpeace report came out just before COP26, which pointed out that about 2/3 of EU military missions are linked to securing access to fossil fuels because they are in limited parts of the world, and we are heavily reliant on them. And if you look at the graph on the right produced by Oxfam, this shows you just what an inequality of emissions is occurring. This is called the champagne glass graph. And you can see that from the shape of it. And it shows that the richest 10% of the world's population are responsible for nearly half of the world's emissions. And that's a really shocking figure. And this is what the military is wrapped up into, is retaining access to these fossil fuels to allow a profligate lifestyle to continue. And you hear in government proposals, particularly in the UK government's net zero strategy, where Boris Johnson said, well, no, we don't have to change lifestyle. We've just solved it all through speculative technologies. And this is not a viable strategy. So turning directly to COP26 and what was agreed, the Climate Action Tracker, which is an NGO that does detailed modelling about what commitments mean in terms of climate reduction scenarios and temperature change scenarios, helpfully modelled the various policies and pledges that were made at COP26. So this is a graph summarising this. So the top line, the top part of the graph, is policies and actions. That means what is actually enacted and active. And so currently we're heading to a temperature change of about 2.7 degrees C by the end of the century, well above 1.5 degrees that we need to be aiming for, and well above even the 2 degrees, which was considered a maximum in the Paris Agreement. So that's where we were at the start of COP26. Various pledges and targets were announced at 26, although many of them, COP26, but many of them didn't really have the detail of whether they would actually be implemented. So they've tried to include Climate Action Tracker have tried to include this. So their first estimate is if we hit all the targets announced at COP26, we'll be at 2.4 degrees. And if we hit all the pledges and targets for the whole period, then we might get down to 2.1 degrees. And an optimistic scenario with a following wind, with increased penetration of some of the more speculative technologies, we might get down to 1.8 degrees. So we're moving in the right direction, but we're really not in the realm of getting us close to 1.5 degrees. And you'll see at the bottom the graph that takes us below 1.5 degrees. That is out of reach at the moment. We need sharper falls, especially over the next 5 to 10 years. And we're not near that yet. And indeed, even this graph shows that you need negative emissions after around 2080 in order to get you to that point. So that's not a very promising outlook. Better than it was, but still not very promising. And the implications of this are that 1.5 degrees is still possible, but it's dependent on very rapid reductions in industrialized countries, which at the moment are politically unpalatable, or they depend on low economic activity in poorer countries, which of course is inequitable, or they depend on negative emissions technologies, which at the moment are speculative and potentially very expensive. So there are some serious problems here. If we go back to the role of the military, what was implied at COP26 is that they're on the unspoken guardians of the current political and economic system that is failing to deliver. And the military carbon emissions themselves are only partially included, as I said, all the exemptions, the undercounting, the hidden emissions. So we have a few glimmers of hope here, and this is the very high-profile campaigning activity that we saw on the ground from youth campaigners, environment campaigners, human rights campaigners. We ourselves, I myself and SGR and a few other campaigners here got much more involved in campaigning on the military carbon emissions issue, and this was much more visible at various events and rallies and protests during the weekend, and it got a lot of attention on social media, and questions were asked within the main negotiations. So we penetrated in a way that we hadn't before, and that gives us a bit of hope for getting this item on the agenda for the future. And the NATO Secretary General, for the first time, turned up at this meeting and spoke about the problem of military carbon emissions. So that is something on the table at least. And the other area that I think is worth pointing out, because it's going on in the background and it's in some ways it's making a quiet transition, is the growth of certain key greener technologies, and wind and solar are particularly doing well, and various energy efficiency technologies are helping take the worst options off the table, which is really important. So what is missing from all this is demilitarization for decarbonisation strategy. Really, we need more focus on diplomacy and arms control. The way countries are behaving at the moment over Ukraine is exactly the wrong way to deal with this issue. We need a much better approach to diplomacy than we're having at the moment, and we need to be looking at using a large fraction, at least, of military spending to fuel a just transition, to get these rapid reductions in emissions over a short period of time, and through a combination of both behaviour change, because often that's the fastest thing, as we found during the pandemic, and through new technologies that are more sustainable than the ones that the military prefer. And that has a tremendous potential to create jobs or maintain jobs in skilled industries. So there's a lot of potential there. And of course, phasing out nuclear weapons it becomes less and less justifiable to have weapons of mass destruction deployed in their thousands while we're having to deal with the threat of climate change. And this all implies, and I think the pandemic has highlighted this, that we need a shift in focus at government level from national security to human security, and the UN has come up with a set of definitions which I urge you to have a look at, and I've listed here. So just to wrap up with a few last items, one thing I wanted to do was give a quick example from the US, a little bit of hope from the US, which is often hard to find these days, but this is a graph produced by Brown University of estimated carbon emissions of core carbon emissions of the US military. And you can see there are reductions in this graph, and you can see particularly how there were reductions at the end of the Cold War, the sharp reduction at the start of the 90s, and then a gradual reduction thereafter. And that's when the biggest military emissions reductions happened. And that kind of shows you that if we do seek a less militarized strategy, there's a lot we can achieve in reducing carbon emissions from military sources as well as more broadly. So a few campaign goals. We particularly need better reporting on military carbon emissions. It's stuff we can see and count. And we need military activities to be included within zero carbon targets, consistent with the Paris Agreement, and the centre of those activities need to be around demilitarisation, and nuclear weapons abolition needs to be part of that. I've got a list of suggested actions, which maybe we can talk about more in the discussion, and some peace campaigners, particularly around targeting other campaigners working on this issue, because the military is often forgotten, climate campaigners, and how they can start to integrate peace issues into their work, and scientists helping to improve the research so we can identify what the military emissions really are, and hold militaries to account when they do start announcing targets, and also economic analyses to point out the benefits of arms conversion programs. So
thank you, Stuart. We will for sure we'll be able to expand a little bit more on further action at the end.
I was just going to say that there is an arms, militarism and climate justice network was formed up. We have meetings from time to time, and there's an email list. Do contact us and go on it as our email address there. We don't yet have a website, maybe we should do. And if you want to get your local peace group involved in this, then please do. There's a few more resources that I've listed there. What I do, I've also put references of where I've got all this information. So these will go up on our website, which is the I don't think I can highlight it easy on there. But on the Scientists for Global Responsibility Climate Military pages, I'll put these slides up there so you can look at them at your leisure.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you for such a detailed overview of the data, which is at the core of what the work you do. Your figures have always been very valuable empirical foundation to our political demands and our advocacy points. So thank you so much for telling us about it. The audience will now have an opportunity to ask one short question if you need anything to clarify. Otherwise, we'll move on to our second speaker. But please feel free to raise your hand if you have any short questions.
Saskia, I think we have a question from Lois Lodge. Looks like Saskia may have had a connection problem, but Lois, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you. Thank you, Stuart, for everything you said. I don't disagree with it. Can I ask for a little clarity on what you mean by this thing you refer to all the time, the military? And I ask because I spent 18 years in the British Army, and I think we need clarity that the military probably means the military-industrial complex is a political tool, and we need to get it from military as if somehow the troops, the people wearing the boots, are the problem rather than who's directing it. And also that the military, which is in part what I've identified with myself, they're the people who pay the ultimate price. So there's something in the messaging that might need a bit of clarity and you might want to expand on.
Yeah, that's quite a big issue. I fully appreciate that decision makers in this area are not the troops on the ground, who often are the ones in harm's way. And I think that's part of the problem, is that, yeah, we are in a difficult situation around that. And military policy, and particularly a lot of the policy in this area, needs to be taken at a higher level. And the military-industrial complex, as it influences the decision-making, has far too much influence on the decisions at a higher level. I think one of the things probably I should make very clear is the way some of the military figures in this area who justify themselves and say, we need to reduce military emissions, but we need to do it without compromising capability. When I disagree with that, it's not about putting troops on the battlefield with inferior body armor, for example. It's not putting troops on battlefields where they shouldn't be. And the whole standoff over Ukraine is a case in point, I think. And there are a lot of examples. Britain's sending warships to the Black Sea to annoy Russia, or to the China Sea to annoy China. Is a particular problem, and this sort of provocative behaviour, NATO carrying out huge exercises with Ukraine, this doesn't help achieve peace, and that's the sort of things that I think we need to be targeting most. As well as the whole arms racing issue, is that we've got to spend money on developing new weapon systems because they are, rather than, and then attempts to come up with treaties to restrict the activities are dismissed as unrealistic. Well, it's unrealistic to have an endless arms race where you're diverting so much money and scientific skills away from where they really would help.
Thank you to our audience for breaking the ice and starting the conversation. In the benefit of the time, we'll move on to our second speaker because we'll have more space for discussion at the end. So yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce Sheila Babauta, who will tell us about how militarism and climate manifest in her own context in the Mariana Islands in the Pacific. She will share some insights on her experience at COP26 as well. Just to introduce a little bit about her and her work, she currently serves in the 22nd Legislature of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. and she holds key leadership positions as a chairwoman of National Resources Committee. She has also been involved in a number of nonprofit initiatives that aim to empower communities in the Marianas to research and implement conservation strategies that are grounded in traditional teachings. In her nonprofit work, she also advocates for de-escalation of militarization throughout the archipelago in the Marianas. Thank you so much, Sheila, for being with us, especially across time zones. I believe it is late evening right now on the Mariana Islands, so thank you for coming. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Saskia. It is my pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen and we will get started.
We can see you well. Thank you, Sheila.
Okay, hafa day, Zantiro. That is how we greet one another, where I'm from. My name is Sheila Jack Babauta, and I am a member of the 22nd House of Representatives from the Northern Mariana Islands. A little background, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands is located approximately 6,000 miles away from the US mainland in the North Pacific region called Micronesia. We are a US territory. We are one of 5. So therefore, we are US citizens. Throughout the presentation, I will be using the term Marianas, which is another way we identify ourselves. So the Marianas is made up of 14 islands, and I was born and raised on the beautiful island of Saipan, located right next to the Marianas Trench, the world's deepest and most diverse ocean. That's me with my grandmother. We spend a lot of time outdoors and near our waters and with our lands. I am a daughter of the Pacific Islands, a descendant of seafarers. We are deeply connected to the land, air, and ocean. And I am here today as a representative of the Marianas, a committed advocate of our natural resources. The issues we face as a territory are complex and range from microplastics that wash up on our shores to the growing military impact threatening the health and welfare of our people. As you can see in one of these photos, those are children playing on abandoned tanks from World War II, as we played a very pivotal role in the launch of the atomic bombs that took off to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Public education that combines scientific data and cultural practices has been our focus, as climate change has really added another layer to the existing routine challenges that we face as a community. In addition to our shorelines disappearing, we have encountered 2 super typhoons and the pandemic in the last 5 years. As I continued to engage with my community as a legislator, I began to learn about militarism, which is something that we did not learn of. We were not taught in school. We did not learn about it growing up. And I started to see maps like this, with lines drawn in the ocean, marking areas for military training and testing activities. And maps like this, displaying the role we play in the Pacific Pivot military buildup. Before trying to even understand this map with all these colors and lines, it provided a very clear picture that my home was part of the biggest military playground in the world. Articles were being shared with me like this, using descriptive words like the Royal Navy Carrier Group unleashes hell in the Pacific, and impressive showing of firepower. That shore bombardment exercise happened on one of our islands, Farallon de Mendeniza, circled there. And it's been used for military bombing exercises for the past 50 years. Here's a short clip. And that was our island that they were bombing. And you can see how the military really advertises or communicates the way these exercises are happening. A couple of years later, I was so disturbed by the destructive military presence in my homeland that when I became an Obama leader and got the chance to ask President Obama a question, I couldn't help but really think of asking him about the military's presence in my home and in the Pacific. Here's a short clip that will just show my question to him. Yeah, for sure. So in my question, I asked him about the military presence in the Pacific Islands and how we feel like we're at the table with Goliath. Because we're a very small community made up of 50,000 people in the Pacific Islands. And as I began to learn about the military-industrial complex and the role that we played in the larger picture of the military's strategy, how can we foster a place where we can invite Goliath to the table so that we can talk about it, so that we can foster this kind of dialogue where we can support national security while protecting our natural resources and conserving our natural resources and protecting our culture. And this was just a couple of months after I learned about militarism. Now, a few years later, I have a very different perspective. And so I was able to have the opportunity to travel to Scotland and attend COP26 through my organizations in the nonprofit sector. I was able to become part of a delegation called It Takes Roots. We were about 60 people from the United States and other countries throughout the world coming together to stand in solidarity and really voice our concerns as frontliners. It really gave me a chance to be with allies, to share stories, sit on panels, take part in the largest march that was seen at any COP gathering, and really share how I was born and raised at an intersection of climate change, colonialism, and militarization. I even got to meet up with President Obama again. And this time I got to introduce him before he delivered his speech at COP26, sharing our story and experiences on a larger platform. After that introduction, I sat in a roundtable with President Obama and other young leaders from around the world doing amazing work organizing to combat the climate crisis. And I focused my remarks on militarism, its negative impact on the environment, how there's lack of reporting, how the US military is the largest consumer of fossil fuels and the largest polluter. And it was not even on the COP26 agenda. And so I really expressed my concern about that, because if militarism is not being discussed at COP26, then where are we talking about militarism? Because those are the kind of spaces that I wanted to be in so that I can advocate for my community there. As I returned home and continued to advocate for environmental protections around permitting requirements for our northern islands, solutions to addressing plastic pollution here locally, and garnering support to protect our oceans from nuclear waste dumping. The government of Japan has announced their decision to dump over 1 million tons of nuclear waste into the Pacific Ocean. And these kinds of decisions are being made without us there at the table. And so as we continue to navigate and gather the tools we need to address climate change, militarism, and the complexities that come with it, there are 3 things that I want to convey to you. World leaders must commit to fixing broken systems. That looks like increased accountability and transparency for military emissions and reporting, and increased accessibility to these decision-making spaces. I cannot even begin to tell you the accessibility issues and the barriers because of COVID to get to COP26. Vulnerable communities must have a seat at the table, especially when big issues that affect us are being discussed. Conference of the Parties must create a party for Indigenous communities and those at the front lines, because it's becoming increasingly clear that big decisions are being made without our free, prior, and informed consent. Civil society is rising to meet the challenge. Within our limited capacity to meet these complex, interconnected challenges, we are committed to the implementation of solutions with our local, regional, national, and international partners, and we will not stop. At the end of the day, our goal really is to be the ancestors that our descendants will thank. And so I am excited to be here with you today to learn and support one another. I look forward to our conversation, and we'll speak openly and honestly about our experiences here in the Mariana Islands. Thank you, Saskia.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you for your insights, and thank you for sharing such a personal account of your experience around these issues and at the COP26. We're also aware that whereas for others this might be a mere intellectual exercise, for you and for all, but disproportionately for you, these are very personal issues with very real consequences. So I appreciate you being here and sharing your story with us. I have some follow-up questions that I'd like to share with you, and then we can open the floor to any questions from the audience. You said that you need to include people that come from places that are particularly affected by these issues. So when we talk about including voices from these communities that are most affected, what does it mean concretely? So based on your experience, what are some concrete steps that can be taken to center these voices and give them a place at the table?
Thank you for that question, Saskia. You know, attending COP26 was my first time. Coming from the Mariana Islands and being a U.S. territory, we depend on the United States to represent us in these spaces. But I can tell you now that many in the U.S. have no idea where we are and what we're going through. So that's why I felt it was really important to advocate for ourselves. And after learning you know, much of the decision-making space at COP26, going there as a politician with that perspective, I began to see quite quickly, honestly, how the negotiators were inside the space, and then you had civil society outside organizing, and there was still a huge gap in communication. So I believe that concrete steps in order to get the communities adequately represented would be to have a seat at the table. And if, you know, if there can be a party, it's conference of the parties. And so if we can have a party, negotiators with votes who represent Indigenous communities and communities at the front lines, then they will have direct access to these spaces. And I think those are concrete steps. I'm not familiar with the actual process of getting that done, but I think it can be done.
Yeah, for sure. Willingness, I think, is at the heart of many of these issues. So if there's a political willingness, then the means to do so will emerge. I also think I'm worried that sometimes this kind of discussions become very technical and become about making the military efforts more energy efficient. So I'm wondering if you can reflect on the justice aspect of the approach. What would a justice-based approach look like for you?
Yeah, you know, in our experience, a justice-based approach really is about protecting the rights of all human beings, right? Whether or not we are a huge developed nation or a 14-island, 50,000 person community in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. But I can tell you that to this day, we have unexploded ordinances littered throughout our islands. We have abandoned tanks leaking fuel in our ocean. These are all from World War II. it's been over 75 years and we're still waiting for the United States, for, you know, the parties who are involved to take responsibility and really clean up their mess. Our community is becoming sick. We have had to sue the United States through Greenpeace to come and clean up some of the waste that's been dumped and the people who got sick. And so, you know, having a process in place like what Mr. Stuart Parkinson was talking about, with holding the military accountable through reporting and, you know, getting that kind of process is going to be a lot, but I think that it's definitely worth it, and it's something that we've been waiting for a long time. So reparation, what does that look like? Yeah. Oh, and I just wanted to clarify too can I just clarify one thing?
Yeah,
and then this was,
go ahead.
It came to mind because of the question that came up earlier, and you know, the military activities that happen here really are the U.S. Navy, the United States Marines. There are different branches of the military, and we tend to generalize when we speak of the military impact here in the Marianas, but the United States Coast Guard seems to be one branch who serves as more of an environmental steward. So if we can redirect funding to protecting our environment and really support those kinds of organizations, that's really what we're hoping for and really advocating for.
Thank you, Sheila. We're indeed very honored to have been able to learn from you about the realities of the Mariana Islands. We also really hope to have more opportunities to hear from those who are living the consequences of the climate crisis, but also live in places that are highly militarized. I will now give the floor to Martin, and he will facilitate the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, friends. So now, as we were suggesting at the beginning, this is half an hour for much wider questioning to all members of the panel. Everyone has contributed, and indeed, many of us have things to say about our own experience. And we particularly are interested in focusing on the possibilities for action for where we are. So remember what I said, so there's lots of people on the screens. We might miss your hand. So if time passes and we haven't seen your hand, then just unmute yourselves and ask your question. So just looking at my screen, we'll start off with questions from our friend, just says Ramsey, followed by Jeff, followed by Svetlana. So 3 in a row. Perhaps we'll have them one at a time and see how that works. Ramsey.
Thank you, Martin. A feature of Zoom, by the way, that might make life easier for you is that if you click on participants, I think it shows the host and those with their hands raised first. At least that seems to be the case. So anyway, coming straight to my question now. So first of all, thank you to the speakers today. Listening carefully, I see that on the one hand, those who make the decisions in favor of militarism are almost in a separate space from those who are protesting against it. But the space where those two come together are, on the one hand, legal action, and I would be very much interested to know from Sheila what was the result of that legal action through Greenpeace. Another situation is indeed supporting parts of the power authorities which are acting in a more responsible way, like the US Coast Guard that you mentioned. Again, I'm interested to know in what way support was able to or could be given, and what impact that can have as a ripple effect to the wider part of the establishment. The final part of my question is that political powers partly rely on being seen as legitimate, both morally and legally, and politically, and competent as part of that. Now, the example of the situation in Ukraine was mentioned. And indeed, I would agree that there is a question mark over whether the way that crisis is being handled is competent. Is it competent to escalate or in fact to de-escalate? And therefore, what ideas would people contribute to questioning and holding to account the competence, the political competence, the diplomatic competence of the powers that be in handling such crises? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramsey. Perhaps, Sheila, you might start by asking that, responding to that, and then Stuart might want to respond to the second part.
Great. Thank you for your question, Mr. Ramsey. The answer to your first question, so the legal action that took place was successful. And so then the U.S. military, this happened over 10 years ago, they had to come in and clean our soil. They had to come in and set up facilities to test our people for what is known as PCB in their bloodstream, and offer reparation. And so, you know, I agree with you that that is a space where the powers that make the decisions and those impacted come together. But I also am well aware of the lack of resources that it takes for a community to even have the energy to organize and fight for decades and decades. The burnout is real. It's almost like the generations just pass on, right? The fight to the younger leaders, and as we go on in the future. So I look forward to the day where we don't have to fight and we can just live in peace and enjoy our natural resources. But that might be overly optimistic. And then just going into the question about how does supporting the other power authorities like the Coast Guard looks like, it looks like opening more bases for them around the Pacific Ocean. So the Pacific Ocean is bigger than the United States continent. And studies have shown that it's like having only 10 vehicles to really scout and enforce. If you had only 10 vehicles for the entire United States mainland, that is just insufficient. So if we can support them by offering more ships and boats and helicopters and public education funding, that would be welcomed by our people.
Thank you, Sheila. Stuart, do you want to add anything to the last part of the question?
I guess just around getting into spaces where you might be able to have an influence. I mean, one of the things that we've been trying to do around military carbon emissions is we managed to get a few questions into the parliamentary process through the Environmental Audit Committee, which is a committee in the UK Parliament, when they held an evidence session with the leaders of the military climate programs. So asking some pointed questions there, and there's more to be done along that path. I think another thing that we are going to pursue is looking to work with some of the civilian agencies who work on climate change, who really don't understand the extent to which they are not covering military issues, because they appear to be smaller than they are because the data's not good, and so working with them to help them see what the real data is, or at least ways of finding better data. So that's on that side. I mean, moving up to a bigger level and talking Ukraine, I mean, this is a whole huge issue, and the points, I won't go into any detail, and I'm not an expert on Ukraine, but there have been some very interesting things pointed out by some senior campaigners around the need for Ukraine to become a neutral state for example, in the way that Finland and Austria and Switzerland have, and that would be a way out of the current crisis, and more decentralization within Ukraine that would allow a greater variation of activity within the country, so that the Russian-speaking area would have more control over their affairs, the Western-leaning areas would have more control over their affairs, and if that could be a way of dealing with some of the at least immediate problems. Yeah, I mean, NATO could really help by just saying, okay, Ukraine's not going to join NATO. That would really help.
Thank you, Stuart. Friends are putting comments in the chat, which we can all keep an eye on. So Jeff and then Svetlana, and if we try and keep our questions concise, then we can possibly get more questions in. Jeff.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentations. Excellent. Two basic questions. One is, how do we get what is really a very simple idea across? Look, to defend humanity against climate change, pandemics, inequality, etc., biodiversity loss, we simply need to redirect everywhere in every country, every year, a percentage of the military to things that would really help in that, including using military skills that could be used for rescue services, etc. That's a very simple idea to get across, and it could cross all the different groups that are concerned from the different angles. I mean, there's a little group in Hampton Bridge called the Ploughshares Group, which Philip's also involved. The second area is, where can we get people doing work on scenarios to how you would achieve the different elements of this change? Because we've got a lot of think tanks that work on gaming, war scenarios. We need to get those think tanks looking at the scenarios that could actually move into this direction, a progressive annual global redirection of military expenditure, which cannot defend human security, into the things that can defend human security this century. And we're trying to encourage work on that, but we're a tiny group, so if you know anyone else doing it, or if you want to do it, please do. Thank you. I put some links into 3 blogs that were about this that you can find in the website.
Thank you, Jeff. I wonder if, Philip, you want to come back on the local groups and the work of Northern Friends Peaceboard in relation to that.
I mean, there was one particular question around military spending, when Stuart and I are both part of the UK steering group of the global campaign on military spending. And we produced some particular resources with Stuart's obviously expertise playing a big part in that. And we would welcome other groups, other Quaker groups, other groups to be part of the global campaign on military spending wherever they are in the UK. We've got 2 of us here, and there will be other ways of engaging with that. But also just to flag up another network, which we're both part of, the Rethinking Security project, which in the UK is really looking to work to listen to the grassroots at all levels, and as well as expertise to really formulate a very different approach to building security in the world and in the planet. So that, and there are other initiatives like that in other parts of Europe and in the world as well. So and each of these projects has opportunities to sign up for information, for actions, and opportunities for engagement. So please look. I'll share the links with those in the chat as well.
Thank you, Philip. I'm aware that we won't cover all the issues, but between us we'll pick up as many points as we can. Svetlana, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you so much for this opportunity. So my question builds up a little bit on what Mr. Philip just said about getting the voice of the grassroots movement heard. My question relates to how can we as individuals that are not in politics or not in decision-making roles, how can we use our collective power? Of course, we can sign petitions, but how can we take that step to the actual decision makers? And I think Ms. Sheila can talk about this one. I think she has a lot of experience with the politics. So how is there a system where you collect the voices of youth or voices of peace building groups, and also anybody on the panel who has some experience with that? Thank you so much. That's my question.
Thank you, Svetlana. Sheila, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you, Svetlana. That is such an important question, and honestly, we're still trying to figure that out. We usually get the answer of public pressure, right? To pressure the politicians, pressure the leaders into making these decisions. But if you look at COP26, and we had that People's Day of Action march, where organizers were expecting 10,000 people, and we ended up with over 150,000 people marching the streets of Glasgow. And you see that happen, and then you see the outcome of the COP26 agreement and how it was almost like just such an extreme dereliction of duty, right? And so these are the systems, the broken systems that I believe are in place that we really need to figure out how to get those voices at the table. I really believe that the voices need to be at the decision-making table.
Lindsay, Phil Cook asked a question.
Thank you, Sheila. I didn't catch who that voice was. Was that someone responding? Adrian, was it? No? Go on. Thank you. Can we move on to Nola? Your question, please. You're just on mute.
Oh, it's just a little technical question. I don't want to distract from the main one that you're talking about. But when you said people got sick, Sheila, from the ordinances and everything, and you did mention PCBs, was there any indication that there was radioactive sickness or anything from depleted uranium being used? Have you any idea of that? What sort of sickness do you see there?
We see a large rate of, a very, very high rate of cancer, different types of cancer in the throat. We see that it's really, they were testing, this happened when I was in junior high school. And so a lot of the research that I find now, I'm really learning more about it, but it really was around cancer, and they did the testings on PCB and yes, radioactivity. The thing with the military is they've been a part of our history and a part of our community for so long, and there's no reporting at all. So that exercise short clip that I showed during my presentation, where they've been bombing one of our islands for over 50 years, we know nothing about what's going on there. And so recent Google images have shown that parts of the island were actually breaking off, and the military came back to show old footage and old photos kind of countering that accusation. But we are very connected to our ocean, and we rely heavily on eating the fish and all sea creatures, crabs, lobsters, shrimp, we rely on that for even mental health, not just for food, but we go out into the water and we swim. And so, there just needs to be more communication and reporting in that area. But I'll share some links and articles with more detailed information to Saskia, and she can share that out to the community.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Sheila. I would like to move on to Lindsay Fielder-Cook, who's put a question in the chat, but if you're there, Lindsay, if you'd like to ask a question for Stuart to respond to.
Yes, thank you. And thank you both for this wonderful, and QCA for this wonderful event. And I heard the call for an IPCC special report on military and climate change. Of course, Quakers are one of the only faith-based, or the only faith-based organization through FWCC and CUNO to be an accredited observer of the IPCC. And I wondered if Stuart could let us know if there are any states, either within or outside of the EU, who are officially encouraging this, so that we could have a connection there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Thanks. I'm glad you saw that bit. It was squeezed in right at the end. We had, on the run-up to COP26, a group of peace organisations sent a letter to one of the senior officials in the UK process, calling for an IPCC special report, and they didn't take up our suggestion to push this. So we're now looking at what next steps, and we'll be looking at scientists that we have contact with in the process, who are currently involved in the process. I was involved many years ago. Yes, to try and take that forward. There seems to be some processes, but it would really help if there were other organisations pushing as well. I didn't realise the Quakers had an affiliation. So maybe if you send me your contact details through the chat, we could have a conversation about it. That would be really good. Because I think until the IPCC says this is a problem, no one will recognise it as a problem. The military are very keen that they've kind of allowed it to go on the agenda so long as they control the message. And the message is that their emissions aren't that big, and they're doing stuff to reduce it, and they keep us safe anyway, so we don't need to worry about it. And we need to be able to ask some awkward questions of that. And one of the ways of doing that, I think one of the best ways of doing that would be through an IPCC special report, where we get to ask those questions and present the data that we have found that contradicts theirs.
Thank you, Stuart. So we've opportunities for more questions or comments from anyone. Sylvia, you put a question in the chat. Would you like to ask that out yourself?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, there's loads of information about lots and lots of things, and I'm sure I should know where to look. But there's obviously a processes before the next COP, and there's also people responsible and drawing up those who are working on these important issues, but without the involvement of civilians. So I was just really asking, where do I find that information if I want to start writing letters other than to my MP and UK government ministers? Is there another process that we can take part in?
So we're thinking about the steps towards influencing COP27.
Yeah, well, please, yes, that's my main. Thank you.
Is there anyone particularly who would like to share your views about that, or the process and more? Can we have Jeff Fielding? You're just on mute, Jeff.
I'm aware that in terms of discussion of global risks, a number of global risks have been identified, including not just climate change, but artificial intelligence and nanotechnology and others. I think synthetic biology has been mentioned. When you look at these, I mean, they offer opportunities as well as risks, but the risks are said to be significant and potentially existential. When you look at these, the investments that have been put into artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, etc., have been significant. The investments put into averting climate change were for a long time absolutely negligible. And this, to my mind, indicates a significant bias of so-called progress towards issues that are high risk and against issues that reduce risk to human societies. I wonder whether Stuart in particular might have any comments about that.
Thank you, Jeff. Stuart?
Yes, I mean, one of the things I'm currently writing, and I'll be publishing it soon, is an article about UK military R&D, and in the wake of the big integrated defence review that the government held. And if you look at the Ministry of Defence's Science and Technology strategy and its defence security industry strategy, you can see some rather quite frightening levels of interest in things like nanotechnology, synthetic biology, AI, robotics, cyber. They're basically trying to draw in as many scientists from those areas as possible and make military use of their work. And they're ramping up military R&D spending to enable this to happen. And their particular interests are AI, robotics, and cyber security, cyber warfare. But they're also interested in the others as well because they think they know there are ways of using them. So I think I will share this article as widely as I can. It's published. If you want to join SGR's email list, you'll get a copy of it automatically. And then encourage more campaigners to speak out about this, because this is and trying to get a few of the science organisations to express some concerns, because this is going on, and since Brexit and since the integrated review, this is being supercharged, and there's some very worrying developments there. And if you, I try not to listen to Boris Johnson's speeches, but I did to this one. And although you have to look through his bluster a bit, the world he painted of the British military leading in deploying laser weapons and space weapons and drone swarms is rather frightening. Could I just actually, Sylvia asked a question about getting involved with local group, getting involved in campaigning, and I just wanted to answer that, if I may, because at the end of the talk, I mentioned that there is this network, the Arms, Militarism and Climate Justice Network, which is an international network, and we do encourage more people to join it, and particularly groups that are active on this issue. And if you're an individual and you want your group to be active on this issue, maybe this is the way to do it, is to volunteer for your local Quaker group and get involved and join the network. And that's where we're using this just as a coordinating thing, and it was very successful in the run-up to COP26 to share information on what different groups are doing in this issue, and to come together for events and social media activity and in-person and online events. And it was very, very useful. And we need more of that going on, and we need more people to be writing to their MPs and raising this, and helping it get into more forums, and particularly in environmental groups forums. Climate groups often don't like talking about peace issues, and I think we need to be doing a lot more of that. I think youth groups are much more open to this, but climate groups less so, and trade union groups is quite mixed. I think there's sympathy there, but it needs to be given a push, and I think we're the people to do it.
Thank you very much, Stuart. A question from Adrian Glamorgan from FWCC.
Hello from Australia. I'm in the Asia West Pacific region. My question is really about mini alliances like AUKUS and the Quadrilateral in Asia West Pacific, where the multilateral agencies like the UN are being ignored. And separately, the role of the arms trade and the way it makes itself invisible to its impact on climate, and how we can help peace activists be aware, how we can make climate activists aware that all this money on militarism is a distraction from the climate priority.
Thank you, Adrian. Well, that's a good broad question, which is a challenge for us all. Has anyone got any particular local insights that they might just want to share as to where you feel you've made some inroads into that? Just unmute and share just as you like.
Did Svetlana have a response to that?
Yeah, so as from the perspective of climate activism, because I've been involved in that as well, I would say that it's quite, well, it's obvious and it's known that the military is not only against, well, not supporting the SDGs such as, well, protecting the environment, but also not protecting the peace and the security of the people. So in that way, it acts against the climate activism, right? So then people are aware of it, but there are more pressing issues, and also like they're looking mostly in the greenhouse emissions, and also from the people's perspective, maybe in social rights. And I feel that's an area where it can be a lot more, as you said, as you suggested.
Thank you, Svetlana. Just building on that, Jeff, you've got a question in relation to COP27 and the preparation in Egypt.
Yeah, 2 points there. Yes, I know of this organisation. I don't know if they have any role, but given their title and the person running it, I used to work with when he was a negotiator at the WTO. So that might be an organisation to connect with in Egypt. But I can't say if I don't know or not. On the point about other groups with different interests engaging with the military, for a long time I was involved with the World Development Movement and in the development studies area. And the whole development studies area people are often very reluctant to get engaged with that whole area that affects human development in any country, and that's the military. So I think it's not just in the climate change community. A lot of communities are very reluctant to look beyond their particular focus and the role that militarism plays in the structures they're trying to address.
Thank you, Jeff. Well, friends, it's just about 11:30 UK time. It's been a really interesting session. Thank you very much for everyone who's joined us this morning, and especially can we thank Sheila and Stuart for their interesting presentations, which has provoked and supported our thinking. And Saskia.
Yeah, I would just like to remind people they've asked for resources, names of networks, all these different details. There will be a recording of this meeting available after after we close, so I will share the link with all of you.
So lots of information in the chat, and we will send out information so everyone's got access to that. And there's lots of organisations being mentioned. Just to remind you that today's event was supported and hosted by Northern Friends Peaceboard, Quaker Council for European Affairs, and British Friends Q through Quaker Peace and Social Witness. So thank you very much for those organisations for supporting us today, and thank you again for everyone who has participated. Have a nice day.